Welcome to the Ctbuh 2010 World Conference India. We have an incredible 3 days planned, as I'm sure you've seen from the programme already. I'd like to invite Mr Correa and David Nelson from Foster's. Whilst Charles and David are joining us on stage, let me just explain a couple of things about the next 3 days, and this is for the benefit of speakers, session chairs, and the audience. Every speaker has 25 minutes for their presentation, and we would respectfully ask every speaker to please stick to the 25 minutes so things don't go over. And at Ctbuh we have a little tradition of using a little bell when you have 2 minutes left, so when you have spoken for 23 minutes. So we'll try this out. So nobody gets embarrassed. That's just a reminder for the speaker and the audience that there's 2 minutes left on the presentation. It is my great pleasure to introduce the next speaker. He needs no introduction, but I will try my best. I think he's not only one of the greatest architects that India has produced, I think he's one of the greatest world architects. Charles Correa, and I think the thing that is great about Charles Correa's work, and it's something that I'm going to be talking about tomorrow, is how I think one of the greatest challenges for India and other developing countries is how you develop a modern architecture which continues the vernacular traditions of thousands of years in your country and not look to the import of Western models. And I think if we look around the city, we can see that predominantly it is the import of Western models. And I think Charles Correa, perhaps more so than most architects around the world, has devoted a life's work to creating architecture which is linked to place, which is linked to India. He is obviously the head of Charles Correa Architects here in Mumbai, and his presentation is called India, High Rise and High Density. So can we please welcome Charles Correa to the speaker podium.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me here. And I'll make my presentation very short and just make a few points which I think are of crucial importance. I think the first issue and the key issue is not just how high a building can go, but what goes into the building. For instance, if we build an office building, there are two kinds of problems. One is the parking. But if we have mass transport, enough public transport, buses, trains, taxis, etc., this is not a big problem. Manhattan is a great example. Most people in Manhattan don't own a car. They don't need to own a car. And then the other thing is rush hour traffic. Rush hour traffic is a problem, but that can be mitigated by staggering office hours. So I think the office building is a more amenable problem. But apartment buildings are another thing. Families need more than parking. They need schools, hospitals, play fields. Let's look at the numbers, shall we? Now, if we look at the amenities per person, and these are the amenities recommended by our government and by our authorities. The schools and hospitals should be about 6 meters per square meters per person. This has been lowered recently to 6 meters. It was higher, but this is what's been used in the Delhi Master Plan. Green areas should be about 4 acres per thousand. This is a standard right across, I think, in most places, which comes to about 16 meters per person. If you add that up, it comes to 22 meters. Now, that's quite a large number, and we can say that we could have about 10 meters within easy reach, and another 12 meters might take place elsewhere, like Borivali National Park or the Bois de Boulogne or the Kew Garden in London. It's there, but it's not right in your neighborhood. But at least 10 out of 22 have to be within your neighborhood or nearby. So now to this must be added the built-up space which the apartment needs. Supposing we take a middle-class apartment in Bombay, the average would be 500 square feet. I'm not talking about low income. It would come to about 10 square meters per person. So here we have 10 square meters in the building, and then we've got 10 square meters of open space. and together that comes to 20 meters, and that means an average of 20. Now, if I add another floor, the footprint of the building stays the same, but the amenities go up to 20 and the average comes to 15. You can understand, yes. And then when I go to the next one, it goes to 5 floors, let's say. I would then have 10 again, and then 15, and then 50, and then you get 12. So we're beginning to save on land, but it's beginning to taper off. When I go to 10 floors, I've come down to 11 meters. And then after that, it goes pretty flat all the way up to 20 floors and then to 40 floors. So this idea that I'm saving land only works when I'm looking at the building footprint, not when I look at the other infrastructure needed, which is, I think, what Anthony Wood was referring to. It's not just water supply, it's also amenities, it's also open area. Now, you can see there the two things I mentioned, that at 11 meters it's a little, about 10.5, it flattens out, and it doesn't matter how high you go after that. If you give the amenities, you're not going to put more people in that area. The only way to get more people in, which is the way we do it, is that we don't give them the amenities. We just pack the whole place with buildings. The other thing you notice here is that at 10 stories, it begins to flatten out. Beyond that, you're not gaining for this particular area of apartment. Now, the other thing I would like to point out, that the amount of amenities is directly proportional to the number of persons. It is not 15% as stipulated by the municipality. That's a ridiculous rule, and it worked when we had 2-story and 3-story development across Indian cities. Today, people build 20 stories and then they put 15% for the open area. That's ridiculous. In any country, in any city around the world, it's directed to the number of people, the density you're creating. And we could do that here. So to say that you give me more FAR and I'll house more people is too simplistic, actually. I know the intentions are good, but if you look at this, you realize it's not going to happen unless you condemn them to a life of deprivation for the next 50 years, the next 100 years, as long as these buildings last. That's the kind of city Bombay will become. Now, these calculations were for middle income units. If I go to the units for what is called economically weaker sections, EWS by the government, which is 25 meters per family, which is 5 meters per head, the numbers actually, there they start they start flattening out much, much earlier. And so at about 5 stories, I really don't get more density. If I go in for the luxury flats, now here it makes sense. You start at 40 meters in a flat of 200 meters. That's 2,000 square feet, which is a typical Nepean Sea Road flat, Malabar Hill flat, and a luxury apartment. But even that flattens out at about 20 stories. And you don't really gain. But interestingly, it flattens out at the same number, which is what you chose for amenities. So what you choose for amenities is the crucial issue, how much that should be. Now, so the key thing is not it's not how high we can build, but it's got to do with the amenities we provide. So can we cut down on schools? Maybe we could, but this is a problem for educators. Can we cut down on hospitals, or can we use hospitals more efficiently? Again, this is a problem for hospital administrators and doctors, and we should have conferences about that. It's crucial. For instance, if you could stop playing cricket and start playing squash, or stop playing squash and start playing carom, or whatever, just run in a single place, maybe you'd get much more. You have to think of that. Can you use schools 2 or 3 times over? But just thinking, unless you look at the amenities, you are not actually looking at housing. You're just looking at piling rooms one over the other. So this thing which I showed you at the beginning is the key to it. And I would really hope that during these 3 days even if you don't discuss this, you set up, CTUB should set up another conference which asks these people to come in, and who knows what inventive ideas could come out of really playing fields that could be stacked, for instance, in some way, multi-level. Who knows? We don't know. We've never tried it. But this is actually where you would get higher density. Now, I'll tell you what actually happens nowadays. I mean, what is happening to our city. If this is a typical area of the city, and then we add 3 buildings, there they go. And then, of course, with those 3 buildings comes the amenity space which should have been provided. And instead, of course, and that isn't the responsibility of the developers. That is the responsibility of the authorities. They should not give permission unless they know that that space has been guaranteed. But instead of which, after the buildings are built, the rest of the space is then filled up with more buildings. That's the way Bombay is developing. So it seems to me that because of this, because of the crucial importance of amenities in residential areas, in most cities around the world, the high-rise buildings are in the offices. This is true of Australia, it's true of America. I think it's, except for European cities where the people continue to live in the center of the city, which I will show you. Whereas in these cities, the high-rise buildings are in offices and the families continue to live in low-rise and medium-rise housing. Here, for instance, is Boston. I don't have a pointer, but you can see the buildings in downtown Boston. They're all office buildings except for 1 or 2 on the edge. And look where the majority, like 99% live in Back Bay or in the suburbs, and they've got 2 and 3 or 4 and 5-story buildings, and that's it, and access to all the schools and green that they need. Here is Toronto, a great, huge city, but again, downtown and residential. Here's Sydney. You could look at any city you want. Just look at there on the left, you can see is the famous Opera House, and facing it are houses 3 and 4 stories high with tiled roofs, etc., because they know that in the world with their children, they've got to have these amenities. Now, here's New York. I would venture to say that here in New York, almost every building we're looking at, except the ones right at the bottom, the lowest ones, all the other ones are office buildings. Because what's happened in Manhattan, as you all know, and we keep comparing Bombay to Manhattan, it's quite a different city. Manhattan is mainly a big office center. The only people who live there, as you all know, are the very rich whites and the very poor blacks. Everyone, white or black, middle class, has fled to where they have play fields, where they have schools in the suburbs. The consequence of that is that the downtown area has many problems of alienation, of violence, etc. And many cities around the world, unfortunately, follow that way. Like, I would say, Johannesburg, Sao Paulo, Nairobi, wonderful countries. Brazil, you couldn't get a better, warmer, beautiful country. And look what's happening to their cities because of the fact that people leave those areas. Do we want Bombay to go this way? What encouraged me is what you said, Anthony. Frankly, I didn't expect to hear it this morning, and what Mayank said, that really we have to find a solution which works, and we don't want to turn. Well, here's Chicago. There's another case. You recognize those buildings, except for the lower ones which are on Lakeshore Drive. The rest are all mammoth office towers. No one lives in the Sears Tower. They don't build 60-story apartments like we do in Bombay. I mean, that's a first. In fact, here's Houston. Again, just look at those images. Just think about what I'm saying. That just look right next to the foot of the skyscraper starts the little houses, the almost individual houses. It's not suburbia. It's downtown housing like you have in London and stuff. Let me show you this picture. This is the density of different cities in the world. This was done by the London School of Economics. I don't know if you can see the numbers. That's London, then Berlin, Mexico, New York, Bangalore, Calcutta, Delhi, and Bombay. You'll be happy to know. And here we come first. All 4 of our cities are right at the top. We should be very proud. Now, that doesn't come from tall buildings. The tragedy is that it comes from high occupancy per room. In the worst possible way, we've got very small apartments with not just 5 people, but sometimes 10 people in it. You know that. So this is not a fair shot. It is a crowd, but that's a typical shot, and it's because you were talking about amenities, Anthony, or infrastructure. The roads on Bombay Island, usually roads are 35% of land use on a global level. In Bombay Island, they're 8%. Even swanky places like Kambala Hill have one road over the top, Pedder Road, one at the bottom, Warden Road, and one through the hill, Ultimate Road, and one cross road, Gamadia Road. So we don't have enough space for people to walk. And of course, we've also got high occupancy per room. This is a special case not far from here. These are the poor bhaias at R.A. Milk Colony sharing a room. So I would think that our problem is not to increase densities per se. I'm talking about the residential areas, but first of all to understand what other supportive infrastructure they need, which is all these other things, and then arrive at the optimum density. I'll show you in that respect something which is important, and that is to compare what you may call the density on a plot, the FSI, and the global FSI. If I take, for instance, Marine Drive, as you know, and all of you know Marine Drive. I hope the visitors too have seen it. It's a lovely set of buildings along the water, along Back Bay. And every building has got a 20-foot setback all around. And it's about 6 stories high. So you get actually, oh gosh, I've gone back on that. Could I? Yeah. What you get is, you get an FSI of about 2.2 or so on the building, about 1.8 or so in the global. That means in the whole thing, including roads. If I take Ballad Estate, it's far more intelligent. Ballad Estate has got no setback for each building. It goes straight up from the ground, just like we have in Jaipur, like we have in many cities, in Chandni Chowk, in most European cities. You can go straight up. So although you're only going 4 or 5 floors, you are getting an FSI of 4 or 5. Because it depends on whether you have a little chowk, a little courtyard in the center. And the global FSI is very high because the streets actually double as parking. So you don't really lose on the streets. Now, if I compare that to Nariman Point, now in Nariman Point, you have really tall buildings and setbacks. So here again, the FSI is 4.5, but the global FSI is the same as Ballad Estate. And there's no comparison about the living and working conditions, because in Ballad Estate, which is from the 1920s, you've actually got people, you can find a parking place reasonably near the building you're going to, because the cars are spread out as opposed to one big parking lot. So I would think one of the changes we should look at, we want higher density, we want more intense use of land, but we have to realize it's got to do with building footprint, not just about going tall. And I'll end with this slide of Paris, which is illustrating so many of the things I'm trying to say for residential areas. I don't have to spell this out to you. You can look at it and you can see that there's an organic relationship between the buildings and the people and the sidewalks and the trees and the traffic and the parks. It's exactly the kind of thing you need for housing. It's not just isolated buildings climbing up. No, and it's very high density. I would guess this is the same density as you get in Singapore. In fact, I know it is. It's even higher. Most European cities, and I think I'll be borne out by this. It's just that the image is of 6 stories, and we assume that's not high density. It's actually very intense use of land. So I think I would end by saying that, first of all, I agree with Anthony. I want development, and I want intense and intensive use of land. But it's not just a simplistic thing of saying, let's build higher. I think cities and their buildings are an intricate mix of conflicting entities. To build sustainable cities, and that's a very important word, if you really mean that word in this conference, to build sustainable cities, we must understand this and optimize all the parameters and not just one. And in this process, I think we will not only have to increase the infrastructure, I agree, but I think we should differentiate in the DC rules and the development control rules between what is applicable to office buildings and what are the requirements and what is applicable to residential buildings. Thank you.